Thanks for joining us about our talk on Drupal 8 caching. You're in the right room if you're here to talk about cache. So
hopefully you're here. That's why you're here.
Yeah, exactly. I hope everyone's caffeinated. I know I am, and we are ready to rock. Did you clear your cache? Contextual tour of rendering efficiently. We didn't test it.
Sorry, we didn't clear this cache.
Good example.
Oh, we have to click?
Yeah. So, who are we? Why are we here to talk about caching? So, I'm Stefan Lucero. I'm the Director of Engineering and Development at Forum One. I've worked with Drupal for a number of years in a lot of different capacities. And I've worked with slow sites, fast sites. Usually caching's involved in making one into the other. And coming from Forum One, we're a mission-driven digital agency. We partner with organizations and government agencies helping to achieve their goals by creating impactful digital experiences.
Hello, everyone. My name is Rob Powell. I've been doing engineering for over 10 years, 3 years in Drupal-specific programming. When I'm not doing that and learning more about Drupal, I am trying to find the nearest trailhead to go hiking with my family. I work at MediaCurrent. For those that don't know, MediaCurrent is a full-service digital agency that implements world-class open-source software development strategy and design to achieve defined goals for enterprise organizations seeking a better ROI. I'm so cool using terminology.
Fancy acronyms.
I know, right? Okay, cool. So overview, we're going to try to cover a lot of information. So this is basically our blueprint for this presentation. We're going to start with caching. What is it? We're going to start really basic, and then we're going to ramp up real quick. We're going to go over Drupal 8's caching API special sauce, which is the cacheable metadata. This is what allows us to do everything that we're working with in Drupal 8. We have a lovely example, at least we think so, for
fancy. I like it.
For the dashboard caching exploration. We're going to step you through an example that we made customly for this presentation. Then if we have time, we're going to go over some tips and tricks, some gotchas that we've learned throughout our time working on Drupal 8. So why cache, right? Caching. Basically caching's everywhere. Everything that we experience online is cached, down from our browsers to the servers, everywhere. And what are we talking about specifically when we're talking about Drupal 8? Well, all caching really is it allows us to take these expensive processes or calculations and allows us to say, okay, that thing's expensive. I don't want to do it again. What's a reasonable way that I can store that information so I don't have to, let's say, run to the database and get it again? And so we can think about caching as basically avoiding unnecessary computations.
So as we dive into the concepts of caching, we're going to be focusing on cacheable metadata. And we're going to go through each of these topics in a bit more detail, but just kind of some spoilers for where we're going to go through. We're going to have the concepts for max age, CacheTags, and cache contexts. Right now they're just words, but hopefully by the time we leave, they'll be a little bit more than that for you. And the best way to really establish what these are and how they work is to have a concrete example. And that's where we're coming in with our handy-dandy example that I said I thought was fancy. So we're going to build a Scamalytics dashboard. So this is a dashboard for viewing all of the data for this company. It's for our favorite spamming, scamming, and phishing agency. So it's fun with the dashboard, so we can build kind of this brick-by-brick experience to walk through, look at how each piece works, and establish what each of the concepts are. And then we'll look at the whole picture and how everything works together to kind of explore all of those concepts.
So I was just thinking about a funny little slogan for our company. You spam them, we scam them. Anyways, so we're going to start off at max age. And we're going to start here because it's kind of like the building block of where we came from to where we are today. Back in my day, we used to clear the cache all of the cache based off of time. So in Drupal 8, max age defaults to permanent. It defines the maximum length of time a cache can be considered valid and useful. Primary method for time-based expiration. Once that time limit has hit, it's going to be the tool that basically invalidates the cache. But in this conversation about D8, it's much less commonly needed. And we have an example of our spamum.
It was so awesome. It brought it all down.
We broke the internet. Oh, I'm the same.
That's why you cache, so that you don't have performance issues like this.
So we have an earnings report here. This would be part of our dashboard. Very useful, right? It's still a business. We don't care, how we're taking advantage of people to get their information, get their banking information. But at the end of the day, we need to make a profit. So timed expiration could be useful in a use case where, let's say, we have a third-party tool that tracks our sales, right? And we want to get that update from that third-party system. We don't want to necessarily get it in an inefficient manner. So what could be a good metric to trigger or basically invalidate that data and get it freshly from this third-party system? So timed expiration could be a possible use for that. We could cache that response from the third-party system. We can say, all right, let's cache that daily, hourly, weekly, whatever we want. And we could set that on the cache. And so this is what a render array might look like for that. So you'd have the render array. You have the hash cache is where this cacheable metadata would be stored. You'll see examples later on, but this is where you're going to see tags, max age, and context. It all goes into this nested array. And as you can see here in the example, we have this max age set to 3 hours, which is in seconds. So we have the nifty little calculation there for you. But basically, once this max age is hit, once Drupal tries to go back and try to read this caching record, it's going to say, hold up, everyone. This is invalid. I need to go get a new. I need to go back to the third-party system to get that.
I think before we leave that one important concept to realize, and feel free to dig into it more later, but it's important to realize that once this expiration is hit, so if we view this and put the cache entry into the table, it's going to say it expires in 3 hours. But there's nothing that goes out into the database in 3 hours and removes that right away. So if somebody doesn't view this until 4 hours later, the cache entry is still there. The expiration is checked when the data is looked up from the cache table. So that's how it's going to go through. Every time you look up a cache entry, at that point it's going to check, has it expired already? And that's how you're going to determine if it's valid or invalid cache entry.
All right, next up.
The next concept we're going to dive into is cache tags. So this is one of our first ideas that really kind of introduced better tools to work with caching rather than just expiring things after our best guess of how long it's going to take for it to be invalid. So the introduction of these tools really helped to make us stop getting those calls from the clients saying, like, can you clear my cache? Like, my edit is, like, I edited this page, it's still not showing up. And so we can, like, cache tags and the other concepts we're going to cover, give us better tools to react to changes and specifically invalidate caches so that we can keep our content up to date rather than just having this best guess or even worse, this manual process of clearing the cache when we think that the content needs to show or when the client thinks that the content needs to show. So cache tags are like beyond just the time-based approach. By default, most of the time-based approach is set to permanent. So essentially, the max age is disabled, so it's not going to have a time-based expiration for any of our objects. But with cache tags, that's how we address that so that we still get things invalidated. Cache tags tell Drupal about what the actual content Cache tags tell Drupal what the actual content being shown is, so that Drupal has more information about what it's showing and can behave a little bit more intelligently about what's happening there. So if cache tags are showing content, the idea is that tags will tell you specifically the items that are within it, and that lets Drupal, when it identifies, okay, something changed, I need to invalidate these records. So, for example, a lot of the cache tags are structured in a format where it's the type of entity and the specific identifier for that entity, so that makes a unique string to look up each of the entries. So, for example, node 5, that's the entity type and the node ID, so that whenever node 5 is updated or deleted or created, then it can find all of the cache entries that relate to that. Maybe it's shown in a list here. Maybe it's actually like, this is the page that node 5 is shown on. Drupal can go and search for all the cache entries and say, all of these relate to this that just changed. Let's rebuild those next time that we actually need to look at this content. So that's what the idea behind cache tags is. It lets you specifically target content that is affected by this item that was changed or this event that happened. Beyond just the single item that you can use to target one item at a time, there's also special list tags. So whenever we're in the case where we're showing a lot of content, so maybe a view or some form of list, like reporting, that might be affected by any new content being added, deleted, or updated, that may affect, we have no way to know, even if that node is not listed in the list already, where we would include the cache, like the specific ID, something may have changed that would change the full list that would show up there. So we've got to invalidate those. And that's where we have special tags in there called, like, for the entity type and list. So we have node list, term list, and that's automatically created for any entities within the system. So that's where, like, if any of that type is created or updated or deleted, it automatically invalidates everything tagged with that list tag. That's our method for handling all of these overall lists and displays of content. So our first widget that we're going to look at for our dashboard is focusing on that exact type of collection of data. So we're going to look at a node types widget. Our scammers are using Drupal to track all of their scamming campaigns, and each scam type is a different node content type. So we've got different content types here. We've got clickbait campaigns, we've got phishing campaigns, promotion campaigns, all of these. And the point of this widget is to show within our system the overall breakdown of which types we have the most of. So this would change whenever any of that data changes. So if we add one phishing campaign or one clickbait campaign, the whole structure of this chart would change, so we've got to invalidate it. So the way that we tell Drupal about that is with that node list tag, so that whenever any of those changes, it goes back and it'll update and invalidate all of those cache entries so it knows next time to rebuild it. And just for a special tip, you can use, there's the handy cache tags module. In core, it only has the node list, like the entity list options. But if you want to be more specific about it so that you're not invalidating every list everywhere when one of these campaigns is created, the handy cache tags module lets you tell it specifically what content types or what bundles to invalidate so that your caching can be more efficient. You're not rebuilding everything every time.
Great. So now we're starting to look at the team progress report, right? If I'm a PM for my scammy business, I need to know how my reports, the people that report to me are doing, because we don't like slackers, right? We need to make money. And so one idea that we came up with was this progress report. As you can see, Great Uncle Harold is doing pretty well. Sarah from Credit Card Service is coming up right behind him, though. So what is this helpful with, right? So tracks completion percentage from a user's profile, and really what we're thinking about here is changes when specific users are updated. And because we're thinking about users, we're looking at the user entity, and we're thinking about each one of these users having a unique ID, and so we will invalidate this widget when those users are updated.
The next concept we're going to dive into is cache contexts. So if cache tags tell the specific items that are related to a cache entry, the specific items like the users in our last report that are shown and would be affected if any of them changed, cache contexts talk more about the way the content is being viewed. So an example would be the user viewing it, like additional details about them. What permissions do they have? What roles do they have? Maybe are they logged in or not? Maybe the specific page or domain that the content's being viewed on. Any of that could potentially change content being shown, and that's where cache contexts come in. They tell you the context of the content being rendered. Go ahead.
One thing also to mention here that we can see, for example, the user. It's important to know that contexts are hierarchical. And so what this means is that we can tell Drupal that a specific widget that we create, a specific render array that we create is specific to the role. We can say that it's specific to all roles, or we can go all the way up and say user. Now when Drupal goes through and it renders these things, it says, okay, what's the thing that they have all in common, or what does it roll up to? So if we have an example on a page where we're using role and permissions, when it looks at rendering that, it's going to say, okay, I have a user context. And that's important to know because that's where you can find some issues. But in general, we want to be specific as possible because this is what's going to allow us to be efficient. The fewer records that we write to cache, the more efficient our application is going to be.
So if we look at our next widget, we've got user-specific reports. So looking at the cards right here, this is telling all of our scammers that log in, like, this is my specific progress. This is the information for what I'm seeing and how I'm doing. This is actually going to be different for each user. So for example, if we look at Scammer Joe and Sarah from Credit Card Services, each of them has like different content that they're managing. They've got different progress, different goals. So it's the same functionality, but it's actually different content for each one based on who's viewing the page or who's viewing this widget. So that's what context helps to identify differences between, so that Scammer Joe doesn't log in and see Sarah's progress and all of Sarah's information. That we have to tell Drupal the difference and when that will be different so that it knows to save it separately. And the way that we do that is, again, in the cache key, each of these would need to have tags for like when those are going to change and be invalidated. But like we're simplifying that in this example, mostly so it's big enough for you to read. But the next one's going to be the context that we're adding, and we're saying this is going to be unique per user. So that's telling Drupal that regardless what user you log in as, this is going to show unique information, so we need to save a variation of that for every user. The next way we'll look at it is for permission-based or role-based reports. So if our admins or managers can log in and see more information here, then we can see that they still have the same 4 cards that the other person had. They have their individual goals. And so those are all user-specific. But they also have some admin-specific content. And that's where it needs to check, are you an admin or are you not, before it renders that content. And the way we do that is we could use just a really general permission or really general context so that it's, again, unique for every user. But we also want to avoid having so many cache bins, so we want to be as specific as we can. So that's where we use the user.roles admin cache context. So that boils it down to essentially like we're going to vary on 2 options. Do they have the admin role or do they not? And the one after the colon, that you can put in the machine name for whatever permission or whatever role you're looking for, and it'll behave the same way. But if we wanted to be more general, we could just use user.roles, and that's actually going to look at the full collection or full combination of roles that that user has. But that's going to increase the number of variations depending on how many different combinations of roles somebody could have. So an admin and an editor would have one variation, but an admin and a calendar manager would have a different combination. So that's how many variations are going to be shown in caches. So if we step back now, we're going to look at the bigger picture. We've built a few widgets, and they all kind of come together. We've got an overall view of our dashboard. So let's look at how they all kind of tie together from that perspective.
All right, so we have a dashboard. We took all of these widgets, these components, we put them all together. And what is that, right? That's a page. So a page in Drupal. It's great to think of a page as Drupal as a one big render tree, right? The root of the tree being the entire page, the first level being our regions, second level being the blocks, and you can think about this as the branches, the leaves, and so on, right? And so why is this important? Well, when we're talking about these individual components, each one of these individual components that we created, each one of these little widgets that we've shared with you today, all have their own unique cacheable metadata attached to it, right? So what does that now mean on the page? Well, when Drupal 8 renders this page, it's going to look at every single component that we made, every child, and it's going to start building out that render array. It's going to start bubbling that information up. It's going to take the unique data for the individual component, the unique data that we created, and it's going to send it up to the page. So all 4 of those components that we built need to go up. And what that's called is bubbling.
Bubbles!
Yay!
Okay, so to really explore this concept for what bubbling actually looks like, the best way to really demonstrate that is to walk through an example here. So what we've already walked through is we have all 4 of these separate components, and we've defined them. They each have their own separate behaviors. So our cards up here, they vary based on the specific user. Our graph, our API-driven piece, that is specific to only admins. Only they can see it, and it expires over time. We have our user report. That'll expire when any of these specific users are changed or updated in some way. And we have our node list, just the overview of all the different content types and the breakdown there. So with all of those together, we understand, hopefully, how each of those expires and tells Drupal about the individual behavior that it has in individual pieces. But the concept of bubbling lets us pull that up. Each of these squares is cached separately, so when Drupal gets to it, it doesn't have to recreate it if it's still valid. But to save Drupal even more time and be more efficient, it tries to cache it at the top level as well. So it'll assemble all of these individual cache tags and contexts and the max age, all that metadata. It wants to pull all of it together and cache the whole piece so that it doesn't have to, if we've already viewed the whole dashboard, we don't have to render the whole thing again. We can stop at the page level altogether. But what does that look like whenever we're building out the page? How does the metadata bubble up? So for our cache contexts, we've got 2 of them that have the cache contexts on there. We've got user and user role admin. So how would that bubble up? Would it be user role admin? That's most specific. That's actually not going to be the case, because in order to determine how it's going to vary, and it needs to know what the item with the most variations is going to be, so that we don't have any overlap. So it takes the highest level context. So the cache context is going to be user. Max age is a lot simpler. We've only got one item with max age, so if that expires, the whole page, the whole dashboard itself, needs to be rebuilt. So the max age bubbles up, and we've also got the tags. those come together, and the tags just kind of, it's the union of all of them. So we've got each of our individual user IDs, and we've got the node list tag. So the overall page, like, has the cached version of that page, has all of this information put together, and any of that changes or invalidates is going to change, like, the cache entry and make it rebuild. So, Rob, do you think you can walk us through an example here?
Oh, I would love to. So now we've talked about how this information gets up, right? So let's go over some examples of what is going to invalidate them. So right here is, again, this concept of the page cache. And so user 1, admin 1 has gone in, they've looked at this page, that page is now cached. If they refresh the page, if they log out, log back in, that's still going to be cached, and the database doesn't have to build all of that data out again. However, if another user who's an admin role goes in, we're talking about a page hit, page miss. I guess I jumped the gun there a little bit. So after the page miss, it has to go through and determine each one of those individual components again and say, okay, I need to build this from the children back up to the parent. So what other components on the page need to get that cache data? So it says, oh, interesting. Context user, that's a miss. I need to go back and rebuild that. We see that because they have an admin role, that they're not going to have to rebuild our financial data. Because none of the users have been updated during this time, the percentage complete is still valid. And last but not least, the node list is still good. So this is, again, is an example of another admin user logging in, and us having to rebuild the page cache. But after the first page cache record in the database was a miss, it didn't exist for this particular user, we had to go then through each one of the individual components, each one of those individual render arrays that we showed you earlier, and check to see if the cache existed, and if not, rebuild it.
What happens if there's a new node created? So if we have a new node created, then either one of these users logs in. So we've got the page level cache already built. So then Drupal refreshes the page. We look at this dashboard. It's going to check all of these cache tags and find out, like, oh, there was a new node created, so our node list tag invalidates that top level cache. So our page cache is a miss. So then we've got to build each of the components again. So let's go into the dashboard. Okay, we need to look at our cards here first. We've already viewed this for our user, so that's still valid. We don't have to rebuild that. We'll use what we already had. Go to the next component. Still valid. Still valid. But our node list changed. So we've saved time and already used the previous versions of 3 of these components, but this one by itself needs to be rebuilt. So we'll rebuild that. And once we're done rebuilding it, we'll throw that in the cache. And then once it bubbles up, our page cache is refreshed again. So that we've got the whole dashboard. So if they refresh this page before another node is built, Drupal doesn't have to go into it again. It just gives you the same stuff all over again. That sounds lazy, but Drupal wants to be lazy.
We want Drupal to be lazy. All right, so that was a lot of information, right? And I know when I first started in Drupal development in general, I was like, okay, where's the magic here? Like, what is causing this all to happen? And at some points, it does feel like magic. But the great thing here is that we actually can show you how this works. And out of the box, Drupal uses the database to track the caching data. So we gave you a really big abstract, our great business endeavor. If anyone wants to invest afterwards, come see us. But let's go back to something we all know, right? Vanilla Drupal. Hi, friend. So if we look in the database, we will see that there are several caching tables. All of these caching tables share the same data structure. We have a CID, data, expire, created, serialized, tags. The things that we've discussed so far, tags was a big one. Cache ID we're going to review shortly. Data that's the actual code or the result of the calculation that we're looking for. That process that we've been talking about today, caching, that's where it's going to be stored, in the data field.
We've talked a lot about like the rendering process, so that's what we've been focused on. Most of that's going into the cache render table. But it's important to remember that there's all these other tables, and caching doesn't just apply to rendering. That can also apply to any of these other processes, like discovering files, discovering plugins, any of the time-intensive calculations that Drupal wants to avoid doing. That's what's going to vary between each of these tables. They may all have the same structure, but the structure of the content may be different for each one depending on what's being saved. So let's start with the cache ID first. The cache ID is a unique identifier for each cache entry, and that's got to be different so that Drupal knows that, like, okay, if this depends on a specific user, I need a different identifier for each user so that I'm not overriding it for one user and we're getting the wrong thing. So Drupal needs to know how to look up this and how to pull it out based on where it's at, what it's building. It doesn't know what the individual detail, it knows what content it's trying to build, but it's got to be able to put together enough information to know how it's going to look it up the same way every time so it can find if there's already a cache entry for it. So this is the magic that happens with that. This beautiful string that everybody's glazing over, that actually has all of our unique information that is assembled and makes for our cache ID. But let's break it down a little bit. First, we have keys. So our keys are the first chunk of this. They're all concatenated. And so each of these pieces, feel free to look down here on the bottom because that's highlighted, but it still sucks to read. So we've got our keys. We've got entity view, block, and bardic search. This tells you the specific thing that it's trying to build, which is the block that I've got a picture of on the side there. So we're building the view of an entity, and it is a block entity, and the name of that block is block search. So when Drupal gets to this point rendering it, it knows all of that information. So that's it puts all of that together so it can say anything leading with this is trying to render this block. But then we get into the different variations of it. How do we know that it needs to be different in this case versus any other? That's where the contexts come in. So if we look at the rest of the string, we've got all of our contexts put together, and you can see that in the square brackets, that's the name of the context that we're adding, and then it puts the actual value in it. So whenever we're looking at it, like right now we have language interface, English. So if we look at the same page in Spanish, it's trying to put together this cache ID. That value is going to be different, so it's not going to find this specific entry. And that's how the cache contexts make for different validations, or different IDs. So the out of the box, if you look up the same block in your database, the hash may be different for the user permissions, but this should be the same set of contexts that you're going to see. These are the default required contexts for the render cache.
Right. So another column in the table, one that we've talked about a lot today, is CacheTags. And so CacheTags is just going to be a space-delimited string concatenating all of the cache tags that we've talked about. So going back to that page example that we shared earlier with the dashboard, it's going to take all of the tags for each individual render array, and it's going to capture that into the CacheTags field on the table. And what this allows Drupal to do is it basically gives Drupal a target of when to invalidate. Drupal is going to say, okay, this dependency has changed. All right, now when this gets rendered again, or specifically when it gets rendered again, it says, oh, all right, this is now invalid. I need to go get a brand new thing, a brand new component. And so we can think about this in the sense of like cache tags. Invalidating through cache tags is probably one of the most powerful tools in Drupal Cache API, because what it's actually allowing us to do is, regardless of where your cache data is stored, again, the storing is all in those tables that we were talking about earlier. Regardless if it's in one table versus the other, cache tag invalidation is going to invalidate that cache record for all of those tables for all of those bins. So we have an example, again, using our search block in vanilla Drupal. You can see that we have block view, we have the configuration for the search, we have the search settings, and we have rendered.
So next up, we've got some common gotchas with the cache API, and we are a bit tight on time, so we're going to kind of run through these pretty quickly. But one important concept to understand is we've used different words, invalidation and deletion. They're different words because they mean different things, and it's important to understand that as well.
Right. So what's interesting about invalidation is just because we invalidate something doesn't mean that we instantly have to go fetch a new thing. We can load that invalid cache, especially if we say this invalid cache, even though it's invalid, is more efficient or for this feature more useful than saying, I need to go to that third-party service and pull it back in. So if we delete that cache record, though, that cache doesn't exist anymore, and we will always have to go and get it. Especially in Drupal entity references, making our own relationships to the content, that is really tricky. That's well documented in the community, but that's still a well-known gotcha, is that Drupal doesn't have a good way of knowing, okay, this node relates to that node. That's usually one of those pre-processed solutions where we have to update the render array with the right cache tags. So we can say, hey, Drupal, this is important. And we do that by referencing the cache tags.
One scenario that you commonly run into that as well, like Drupal can handle some of that bubbling up. So if we have an entity reference and we're rendering a tag or rendering a paragraph, then the render tree is going to capture that and bubble it up automatically. But a lot of our solutions for theming are actually like splitting away from the natural way that Drupal renders. So we're overriding templates and rendering things our own way, pulling the data out of the values and taking full control over it. But a common gotcha there is that if you're just pulling the field values out, then you're going to lose this bubbleable metadata. So like your cache keys and the other information that you have in there, like the library attachments and things like that. So like one way around that is you need to make sure that you render the content key within your templates so it captures all of that stuff that isn't in a specific field you're going to look up. A couple more quick gotchas with CDN and purge. The idea with the CDN is that you're going to expose your tags so that Drupal can tell the CDN all about the specific content within that page and when it needs to be invalidated. Purge is a contrib module to help make that connection so that like when Drupal knows that this event happened, we need to invalidate anything with this tag. Purge is going to reach out to that CDN and actually invalidate that for you. That's what makes that connection. But one gotcha is knowing that that doesn't happen instantly. So like just because this node was saved, it's not going to go out and invalidate that on each of like everywhere in that CDN. It does that on cron. So that's a gotcha to be aware of. CDN tags also, like a lot of times it's really hard to pass up the full list of tags that address, like describe every bit of the content on a page. And the way that a lot of CDN modules handle that is by hashing them. So you're getting a comment, like rather than having this long cache name or long tag name, it passes up a hash of them. So that works for fitting it all in and passing it up to the CDN. The purge module can figure that out each time. But if you go into the CDN and want to purge this specific tag, it's not going to be as easy and obvious as you think, like node 5. You're going to have to figure out how it's hashing it to go in and do that.
Yeah, one thing that we have in this presentation in one of the later slides is a recommendation of some modules that we found really helpful, recommendation on documentation that we found really helpful, and Acquia Purge, and I think it's Pantheon CacheTags, that sounds right. But basically these are really well-used, necessary modules to make sure that if you're using them as hosted providers that your site is well cached. And
speaking of later in the presentation,
Yeah.
I know we're all watching the clock. We're almost out of time, so we're going to go ahead and stop here and give some time for questions. Please feel free to come to us and ask any questions that we can help you with afterwards. But another pro tip to leave you with, I recommend that you come and download the slides. We'll be posting them afterwards. And that's where we're going to have a lot of the gotchas. We're going to have links, resources. So go and download the slides and check out all the goodness that we didn't get to. So, any questions?
So midway through the presentation where we were invalidating the admin users cache, you mentioned how if we weren't specifying that it was an admin role, that it would kind of go through all of the users and do that. Can the cache tags ever be a detriment if something like that happens?
Absolutely. So we were gonna. That's part of one of the gotchas that we actually didn't get to. So actually, let's repeat the question, right? So is there a chance where the cacheable metadata can be a detriment to your caching strategy, right? I think that's a reasonable summary. So the answer is absolutely, right? So if we do max age 5 seconds, like how is that going to help anyone, right? We're just throwing it in the database to instantly invalidate it, and we've achieved nothing besides a PR, right? That's basically we can do the same things for each one, right? So you've already brought up a good example around user. So in a big site, if you have multiple users, it's not necessarily going to be a good strategy to cache for the cache context of user, because what's going to happen is that your database is going, or wherever your caching backend is going to get overwhelmed with all of these caching records, and that's where you really have to leverage cache tags to be really focused or narrow with what you're trying to invalidate and how. And similarly with cache tags, finishing that statement is that you can also make your cache tags encompass too much. And if you encompass too much, then you're going to invalidate the cache of a component that you didn't realize, right? And we do have debugging steps that we have in the slides as well that we're going to be sharing. But these are things, especially that we've identified where the caching data is stored. This is stuff that you can actually find out yourself, being like, okay, why did I hit this caching record? And Drupal's pretty good about giving us the ability to debug that. Question in the back.
With knowing what cache keys are available for, I guess, like core cache buttons or contexts, like being able to print a list of those.
So let's repeat the question. So the question was, does core have a good way to report the cache keys that are available? So cache keys are the unique thing in the database that says this is cached. When Drupal renders, it's going to look for that cache key to say, aha, I found it. Let's is this invalidated or not? Let me render it if it's not invalid.
Actually, I think he was asking about what contexts and tags are available. Was that the question?
Right.
Like documentation?
Yes.
Yeah.
Sorry,
I thought it was key. My bad.
So there is good documentation available about what contexts are available. That'll be another handy-dandy link later in the slideshow. But it's in the main cache API documentation on Drupal.org, and you find the cache context page. It's got a big table listing the hierarchy of all the cache contexts that are available, and that's where you can start to see. Forgive the seizure. Anybody's gonna. That's where you can see kind of the nesting, so you can see if it's going to be overly specific or not. So looking at the last section here, this is a representation of that type of tree that they have on there. So you can see user, like if we follow just the path here, we have user, roles, and we can be more specific with role. So at that point, we can, that determines how much variation is going to be saved in that cache context.
One thing I'd like to add too, just before we run out of time, the best way to find out all your cache contexts is was actually a little tip here at the bottom, pro tips. We hide them at the bottom. So one of the pro tip is...
Only the pros know to look there.
Yeah. So if you look at core services and you search for cache context, you will find all the context available for you. In terms of tags, any Drupal 8 entity, either config entity or content entity, has those, it comes with that out of the box. So any entity is going to have a cache tag by its name, the entity name, machine name, and its ID. So in terms of how do you find what's available, as long as you know the entity name and your context available to you via the cache context, you should be pretty good in finding a canonical list.
Another method is there's also a CacheTags table that I believe captures the invalidations of tags that happen. So you can skim through that and hope it happened recently and see a list. Like, depending on your luck, you may find something awesome there.
Sweet.
Any other questions? Anybody else awake? That'll be a no.
All right. Well,
Where are you posting the slides?
I will definitely be tweeting it out, and I will tag Drupal Camp Asheville.
What's your Twitter handle?
Robert Powell. Yeah, I trick everyone because I only go by Rob, but haven't updated that one. But that's
I was
okay.
gonna say, who's Robert?
I know, right? My mom did that to me. What a jerk. All right.
Thank you.
One thing that give us a couple of days to do get the slides posted. So
Are you
just
at Rock Hall?
I'll double check, but we'll make sure that's available.
and if we can upload them to the session page, which I think is a thing, but if we can, we'll upload them there for easily finding it as well.
Thanks, everyone.